Welcome to Lesson 1 of our Learn to Sew series. In this playlist, we're going to learn a variety of sewing skills. We're going to start from the most basic, how to select and thread your needle, and build up to more complicated skills such as garment construction. We're going to learn these techniques through a series of projects and skill building exercises. So I hope you enjoy learning to sew with me. Let's begin. First, for this project, you're going to need a variety of tools. You're going to want to make sure you have scissors, a marking tool such as chalk, hand needles, and then it's also helpful if you have a pin cushion so those needles don't get lost. A needle threader is also great, and a rubber needle puller will be helpful if you have one. Grid rulers are also a fabulous tool for sewing and really helpful. For our first project, we're going to be working on hand sewing. Whether you've been sewing for years or are just starting, hand sewing is essential. So we're going to start with some basic stitches. Today, we're going to be making a name tag stitch sampler. And I'm going to teach you 3 different basic stitches that are really helpful when sewing. For this project, you're going to want a piece of felt as well as yarn in various colors. You're also going to want a piece of cardstock or lightweight cardboard. So let's get started. The first step is to cut 2 rectangles from our felt. We want these rectangles to be 4 inches wide and anywhere from 8 to 12 inches long. The longer your name, the longer you want your rectangle. I'm going to cut my rectangles 4 by 9 inches. So I'm going to use my grid ruler to measure 4 inches. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to use my chalk to mark the width. Once you've cut your first rectangle, you can use your ruler again, or simply place your first rectangle on top of your felt and cut another the same size. If you can, when cutting, avoid using the very tip of your scissors. Sometimes that can make your fabric look choppy, so if you want a smooth edge, it can be helpful to use the back edge of your scissors when cutting. My 2 rectangles are prepared, and so I'm going to select the rectangle that I want to be the front. And I'm going to set the other aside. On this rectangle, I'm going to draw myself some guide marks. I'm going to draw guide marks a 1/2 inch away from the edge. On my grid ruler, there are little lines, and each of these pink lines here represents 1/4 inch. So to get a 1/2 inch, I'm going to overlap 2 little lines, so 1/4, 1/2. I'm going to make sure it's lined up all the way down the edge of my rectangle, and I'm going to draw my line. I'm going to do this on all 4 sides. When you're making your marks, you do want to choose something that will eventually come off, because you may see these marks on your final project. So my chalk will eventually fade away, but you wouldn't want to use something like a ballpoint pen because that would always be visible. So the marks that I've just drawn are going to be the border of my name tag. So I'm going to write my name inside that border. Looks like my rectangle's a little bit longer than I'd like it. Since my name was so short, I'm going to trim mine just a little smaller and draw my line again. And I'm going to make sure that my first rectangle is the same size. And it's totally fine when you're sewing to adjust things as you go. So If you notice that something's not working or something needs to be adjusted, you can go ahead and do that as you're sewing. My rectangle's all prepared and I'm ready to start stitching. The first thing I'm going to stitch is the name. So select a color of yarn that you'd like to use for the name on your name tag. I've decided to use this dark purple yarn for my name. When you cut your yarn, you want to make sure that you don't cut it too long or too short. I find about a yard is a good length, so a yard is 3 feet, or about the length of one arm. If you measure from your shoulder to the tip of your fingers, that's a pretty good length. You don't want it too long because your yarn could get tangled. You don't want it too short because then you'd be changing thread all the time. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tie a knot at one end of our yarn. So to tie your knot, just make a loop, pull the end of the yarn through the loop, and slide it towards the end. I now have a nice knot in my yarn. Once your yarn is ready, it's time to select your needle. Choosing the right needle can be the difference between a fun sewing experience and one that's just frustrating. So take your time and make sure you choose an appropriate needle for your project. When you buy a pack of hand needles, it often comes in assorted sizes. Some are long and skinny, some are short and wide, and so you select the needle that you're going to use, usually by the thickness of the thread you're going to be using. In this case, we're using yarn. So when you look at your needle, you want an eye that is big enough to fit the yarn. So since yarn is super wide, we want a really large eye. The eye is the hole in the needle. If you're looking at the 3 needles that I have in my kit, you can see that they have various size openings at the top. I want the needle that has the largest opening possible so it can fit my yarn. So this is the needle I'm going to select. These needles are usually just a little bit wider than the other needles. A lot of times in the assorted set, it's the biggest one that's available. And if you have the option, it's best if this needle is sharp rather than having a blunt tip. If you have a big needle with a large eye and a sharp point, that's the best kind for this project. The first thing I'm going to do is thread my needle. So you can see right now that the eye of the needle is facing me. I'm going to turn it so it's facing sideways. I'm going to place the hook through the opening, just going to slide it straight on through. Next, I'm going to take my yarn and I'm going to grab the end that does not have the knot in it. And I'm going to loop this over the hook. And then very gently, I'm going to wiggle the needle threader through the eye until the yarn slides right through. Then you can take off your needle threader and the yarn is in your needle. We're going to be using what's called single threading here. It means we're going to have one long piece that we're going to be sewing our stitches with, and then a little short end that will keep it through the needle, but we don't actually want both to be part of our stitches. Make sure you have your knot at the far end. For the name, we're going to be using what's called a backstitch. This stitch is really strong and it looks really nice because the stitches are touching. So here's how you do a backstitch. First, we're going to start on the back side of our fabric because this will hide the knot. We don't want to see that on our project. I'm going to start with the letter N, and normally we'd start at the very tip here of our letter. But since I'm doing a backstitch, I'm going to start about 1/4 inch above the starting point in my letter. So I'm going to place my needle up through the back side, and I'm going to come up through the letter N about 1/4 inch from the end. And I'm going to pull it through. Sometimes you got to wiggle a little bit with the yarn, and if you need to, if your needle's slippery, you can use your needle grip to help pull the needle. Pull the yarn through until the knot touches the back of the fabric. Then take your needle and go back down to the starting point of the letter. Gently slide it through. When you pull your yarn, you want it to be just tight enough to lay flat, but not so tight that it distorts the fabric. So now here is my original knot, and here's my yarn coming back up. When I do my next stitch, I'm going to go up too far, about the same amount, so about 1/4 of an inch again. I'm going to go up too far. Pull it through, and then go back. So I now have 2 stitches that are touching. I'm going to check the back of my fabric frequently to make sure that my yarn is not tangled or caught. So I'm going to continue in the same manner all the way through the name. And if your yarn starts looking short, about less than the palm of your hand, then you're going to want to stop, tie a knot, and get a new piece of yarn. So let's keep going. Again, go up too far. And back to touch the previous. That's why this is called a back stitch. So you're always going to be going backwards occasionally. And I'm going to keep stitching like this all the way through the letter N. When you get to the end of your first letter, you have a couple options. You can either tie a knot and get new yarn, or you can just jump over to the next letter. I've still got quite a bit of yarn left, so that's what I'm going to do. You're going to see some string stretching from letter to letter on the back, but that's going to be hidden inside your project. So I'm going to keep going until my yarn gets shorter. So I'm just going to take my needle and jump down from the end to the next letter so I can start the A. And I'm going to stitch this letter the same as before. I just finished the sides of the letter A, and I've noticed that my yarn is getting a little bit short. This means it's time for me to tie a knot. To tie a knot, I'm going to take my yarn and I'm going to make a loop. And then I'm going to go under a stitch of yarn and up through the loop. I like to do that a couple times. So again, make a loop, go under the stitch and up through the loop. And then trim off your yarn. I like to leave about 1/2 inch. And now I can rethread my needle with a new piece of yarn and keep going. Once you think you've got the stitch down, you can start doing the back stitch in one step. So you can put it down in your last stitch and go up too far at the same time. So you can do both things from the same side of the fabric and then pull it up. Again, go back to your previous stitch and out too far at the same time. Back to your previous stitch and out too far. This method also creates a backstitch, so let's go ahead and stitch to the end. I finished using the backstitch to sew the name on my name tag, and since I'm not sewing right now, I've put my needle in my pin cushion. This is a great way to stay safe when you're sewing. It's not very fun to find lost needles by stepping on them, so always use your pin cushion if you have one. I'm ready to start my next stitch. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab my second rectangle. I'm going to lay that rectangle flat and then place the one with the name on top of it. And this time I'm going to stitch my border, and I'm going to use a running stitch, also sometimes called a straight stitch. A running stitch is what you usually think of when you think of sewing. It moves like a snake going up and under your fabric. When I sew my running stitch, I'm going to go through both layers of felt. So this might be a little bit more difficult to pull, so don't forget to use your needle puller if you have one. I'm going to stitch two sides right now. 1, 2, and then I'm going to stop. When you sew with a running stitch, you can just start at your corner. So I want my border to start right at this intersection here. So I'm going to start from the back, and I'm going to pull my yarn through all the way to the knot. And then I'm going to go down to the back. And again, don't pull it too tight. And then go up to the front. Usually when we're doing a running stitch for decoration like this, we keep the size of the stitch and the size of the space about the same. If you find that your fabric is sliding, you can use a few clips or pins, go all the way through and up to hold it in place. Just take care not to poke yourself. I finished sewing the two sides, and now I'm ready to add my cardstock. I want the cardstock to fit within the border that I'm stitching right now. So I'm going to use a ruler to measure. Inside my border is about 7 by about 2 3/4 inches. So I'm going to cut myself 1 or 2 pieces of cardstocks of that measurement. So 7 by about 2 3/4. Yours may be different, but you want it to fit inside your border. I'm going to overlap my ruler 7 inches and 2 3/4 inches. So that's 1, 2, and 3/4. And now I'm going to cut out my rectangle using paper scissors. And if you'd like your name tag to be sturdier, you can do 2 rectangles. So I'm just going to lay this one on top and cut another one exactly the same size. Now I'm going to place my cardstock inside my name tag. And I'm going to slide it all the way in to touch my stitches. If it feels like it's too big, like you might hit it when you're sewing, you can go ahead and trim it a bit. Now that my cardstock's in place, I'm going to continue stitching the other two sides just as before. When you get to the end, make sure to tie your knot. So again, make a loop, go under a stitch, and up through the loop. Make a loop, go under a stitch, and up through the loop. The last stitch that we learned today we're going to use for the border of our name tag. What we're going to use for this is called a whip stitch. A whip stitch is fast, it's easy, and it has a whole bunch of uses. And so today we're going to use it to make our border. So when you start a whip stitch, your stitch is always going to go through the back of the fabric, never the front. So I'm going to insert my needle through the back corner. And I'm going to pull my yarn all the way to the knot. And then I'm going to wrap it over the side and come up through the back again. So my first stitch came up through the back, and when I do my second stitch, it's also going to come from the back of the fabric. When you do this, the thread wraps over the edge of the material, and that's exactly what we want. So again, up through the back of the fabric. Try and keep your stitches about the same distance apart and the same distance from the edge if you can. And I'm going to continue this all the way around the edge. I finished stitching my whip stitch all the way around, and I'm ready to tie my knot. Tying the knot with the whip stitch can be a little tricky. We still want the knot on the back because we don't want to see it. I like to tie my knot around one of the running stitches. So as before, I'll make myself a little loop. I'll go up through the stitch and out through the loop. And one more time. Our last step for this project is to add a hanging tie so that we can display our name tag as we like. So to do this, I cut myself another piece of yarn. This piece of yarn is about 18 inches long. And I don't need to tie a knot in this one because I'm not actually going to be sewing with it. I'm just gonna slide it under some stitches. So I'm gonna thread my needle. I'm actually going to use the back side of my needle, the dull end for this. Just take care not to poke yourself. And I'm going to slide my needle under some stitches in the center of my name tag. So I'm going to start at this whip stitch and slide it under until that whip stitch. So I'm not going through any fabric. I'm just sliding the yarn under. And I want to take care to make sure this end stays on this side. And I'm going to keep doing that. And now I can take off my needle. I'll put it in my pin cushion. And my yarn's attached. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. You now know how to do a back stitch, running stitch, and whip stitch. Join us for the next lesson at Learn, Create, Sew.